The story of Brawn GP is one of the greatest underdog stories in F1 history. A team born out of the ashes of the abandoned Honda project that barely had enough money to survive the first half of the season and had very limited upgrades throughout the year due to budget constraints, managed to win both the Drivers' and Constructors' Championship in their only season, before being sold to Mercedes for the following season. All this from a team that only just made it to the opening round of the season in Australia. But what if it didn't happen? What if despite their best efforts, the Brawn GP project didn't make it and became another of the many teams that had ambitions to race in F1 but never did? Well, let's look at an alternative 2009 where during the winter break, it has been announced that the Brackley-based team has not found a new buyer in time for the 2009 F1 season and will fold, meaning that there will only be 18 cars on the grid in 2009. So what happens to Brawn GP and their employees? Well, for a lot of the personnel at the team, such as the engineers and the mechanics, this would be a horrible experience, especially for it to happen during a recession. Hopefully all the personnel would have been able to find work elsewhere, such as at the new teams entering F1 the following season. Moving on to the drivers next, and it sounds pretty likely that Jenson Button would have joined Toro Rosso in 2009, replacing Sebastian Bourdais, who had a disappointing 2008 season. Rubens Barrichello had no plan B for 2009, so the Brazilian would not have a drive at the start of the season. But I do have one idea. After Felipe Massa had his horrific accident in Hungary, what if Ferrari hired Rubens Barrichello as his replacement? Rubens had previously raced for the Italian team for 6 seasons and would be popular among fans and any Brazilian sponsors that the team had. Apart from this though, I imagine he would have to take a sabbatical. So with all that said, what could the 2009 season have looked like without Brawn? Well, the opening round in Australia would initially see Lewis Hamilton declared the winner, which would be very impressive considering that he started from last place on the grid. But what would be even more impressive is that after Hamilton was disqualified for misleading the stewards, Toyota would get a 1-2 finish after both cars started from the pit lane. This would be Toyota's first win and could lead to Toyota staying in F1 after 2009. According to many Toyota personnel and journalists, had Toyota gotten just one race win, they would have remained in F1 in 2010. The following race in Malaysia could also throw up an interesting result. Without Brawn GP on the grid, Nick Heidfeld would take his first win in F1 and BMW second. The rest of the season would only see Red Bull, McLaren, and Ferrari winning races. Both Red Bull drivers would fight for the championship, with Sebastian Vettel eventually being crowned the 2009 world champion. This means that Vettel would eventually become a 5-time world champion and would break the record for youngest world champion a year earlier than in reality. Moving on to 2010 now, and there are many questions that need to be answered. The first one is, what do Mercedes do now? After Spygate, the relationship had soured between McLaren and Mercedes, eventually leading to Mercedes buying out Brawn at the end of the 2009 season when they were up for sale. But without Brawn GP, what do Mercedes do? They could remain focused on McLaren, but what I think is more likely is that Mercedes would simply buy another team. And there were a few options. BMW had put their team up for sale and eventually sold it back to Peter Sauber. Renault had also put their team up for sale, which was eventually bought by Genii Capital, who would rename the team Lotus. Personally, I think that Sauber is the most likely out of these options because they would have experience of working with a German manufacturer in BMW, and there was the shared history at Le Mans in the late 80s and early 90s between these two. There would be a few problems though, such as the team being based in Switzerland would make it difficult for logistics since they were not in Motorsport Valley or the European Union. Especially when you consider that their engines are built in England. The next question is, what happens to Ross Brawn? Does he move to a different team now, or would he be done with F1 after the Honda project failed? Honestly, it is really difficult to tell, and I personally don't think he would be working for a team in 2010. One of the major consequences of this is that Michael Schumacher doesn't return to F1. The German joined Mercedes in 2010 due to his long-standing relationship and success with Ross Brawn, but with the Brit out of the picture, the 2006 Brazilian Grand Prix would remain the German's final race. Next question is, what lineup do Sauber Mercedes have? Well, throughout 2009, Mercedes Motorsport boss Norbert Haug was pushing to sign Nico Rosberg, so I imagine he still becomes a Mercedes driver. And from my research it seems that had Schumacher not returned to F1 in 2010, Nick Heidfeld would have taken the second seat instead, meaning that Mercedes would still have an all-German driver lineup. Finally, there's the question of who gets the second McLaren seat. I don't think McLaren would have signed Jenson Button without his championship win, and I imagine the Brit would remain at Toro Rosso with hopes that either Vettel or Webber would leave Red Bull so he could replace them. From my research it looks like Kimi Räikkönen would rejoin McLaren alongside Lewis Hamilton in this situation. This raises many new questions about how the Finnish driver would perform at McLaren. Personally, I think that Räikkönen would do about as well as Jenson did in 2010. He would be a title contender, but he would finish fifth. After that, his performances in following seasons would depend on if the car suits his driving style or not. But now let's go back to the new Mercedes team. How well would they do? Well, their 2010 season would be a lot worse now. The C29 spent the first half of the 2010 season with major reliability issues, and while the car was able to consistently finish in the points by the end of the season, they would still be performing a lot worse than they did in reality. I imagine that in the following 3 seasons, they would perform better than Sauber did in reality, but would not achieve the same success as the Brackley-based Mercedes team did in reality. The only exception could be 2012, where the C31 turned out to be a surprisingly fast car, and with 2 consistent and fast drivers, I could see them still getting a race win like they did in reality. Speaking of drivers, that raises the question of how the Mercedes driver lineup looks through these years. I imagine that Rosberg and Heidfeld remain with the team until 2012, but can Mercedes still persuade Lewis Hamilton to join the German brand? A lot of this would depend on 3 factors. 1. How good would Mercedes perform in 2012? 2. How good would the 2014 power unit be shaping up to be, which I personally think would still dominate in 2014? And last, but most importantly, does Mercedes hire Niki Lauda and allow him to try to sign Hamilton? It was the Austrian's hard work and effort that led to the Brit being signed by Mercedes, and his role would be even more crucial now. Personally, I think that Lauda would still be hired by Mercedes, and therefore, he would be able to persuade Lewis Hamilton to join Mercedes like he did in reality. Alternatively, Mercedes could retain Nick Heidfeld, or they could replace him with rising star Nico Hülkenberg, who was rumored to be going to Mercedes in 2013 had Hamilton decided to stay at McLaren. Now let's look at the 2014 season. With how important the power units were in 2014, and how much resources Mercedes poured into their power unit, I imagine that Sauber Mercedes will still win both championships in 2014. Mercedes would probably still win the championships in 2015 and 2016, but I don't think they would be as dominant as they were in reality, due to this team being based in Switzerland. You see, a lot of the factories based outside of the UK, such as Renault's power unit department and Ferrari in general, have always had a hard time attracting talent from other teams, since most of the personnel are based in the UK around Motorsport Valley and don't want to move to a different country. For example, one of the reasons Adrian Newey never joined Ferrari was because he didn't want to relocate to Italy. While I don't think this would cause an issue from 2014 to 2016 due to the importance of the power units, which were still being built in the Motorsport Valley, this could become a much bigger problem in the following 2 seasons, when Ferrari was a lot closer, and due to the new 2017 regulations, the chassis and aerodynamics became far more important again. However, from this point on, it gets very difficult to tell how Sauber Mercedes would do given how many possibilities there are, so I think this is a good place to stop. So in conclusion, if Brawn GP never makes it in 2009, we never get the fairy tale story of Brawn GP, Jenson Button never gets any more wins outside of his 2006 Hungarian Grand Prix win, and never drives for McLaren, Sebastian Vettel is now a 5-time world champion, and if Mercedes do buy another team, it is unlikely they would be as competitive as they were in reality, but they are probably still very strong during the turbo hybrid era. But what do you think? What would F1 have looked like without Brawn GP on the grid? Let me know in the comments section down below, and I will see you next time.